So welcome everyone, good afternoon, and thanks for joining the latest installment of RockCreek at COP26. My name is Kerry Duggan. I'm a Senior Advisor at RockCreek for Climate and Energy. During the Global Climate Summit, RockCreek is hosting a series of discussions with investors, climate experts, and policymakers to understand the climate negotiations and what they mean for investors, and how the decisions made in Glasgow will shape the future of our planet. One of the standout announcements from the first week at COP26 was a pledge by more than 110 countries, including Brazil, to end and reverse deforestation by 2030. This is a critical development if we're to have any hope of fighting climate change. The World Resources Institute estimates that forest and nature-based solutions can deliver 1/3 of the global emissions reductions needed by 2030. And an important consideration for investors is that every dollar invested in landscape restoration yields $30 in benefits. To help us understand all of this, it's really my pleasure to speak with Crystal Davis, an environmental scientist at the World Resources Institute and the director of WRI's new Land and Carbon Lab. Crystal has been at WRI since 2006, and for most of the past decade, she has served as the director of the Global Forest Watch. The new Land and Carbon Lab, which launched 2 weeks ago, will harness the data revolution to monitor the pulse of the planet's land and its nature-based carbon, and provide decision makers with an actionable information to address the global land squeeze, to combat climate change, protect biodiversity, and improve lives around the world. Crystal, I can't thank you enough for spending some time with us on a busy couple of weeks at COP26. Welcome to RockCreek. Congratulations on the launch of the Land and Carbon Lab. And if you're okay with it, we're going to dive into some Q&A.
Sounds good.
Awesome. Thanks, Crystal. And thanks everyone for joining today. Now, first up, if you could just set the scene for us, Crystal. We have all heard stories about rainforests being cut down, green areas around the world being developed. What is the global state of deforestation? How bad is it?
Well, fun question to start with, but yeah. if we look at the big picture, it's pretty bad. We put in a lot of work in the last decade and beyond, and unfortunately, tropical deforestation is still going up. So in 2020, for example, tropical primary forest loss was 12% higher than the previous year. And yet 2020 was the year that we were supposed to be cutting tropical deforestation in half under the New York Declaration on Forests. So we're way off our targets. And of course, that has huge implications for the climate. The IPCC estimates that deforestation is about 13% of human-caused CO2 emissions. So another way to put that is if tropical forests were a country, it would actually rank 3rd behind the US and China. So it's a big problem. That's the global story. If we could drill down into specific places, there are bright spots, there are less bright spots. But the big picture is we've got a long way to go still.
No, that was quite the setting of the stage, but I think everyone is really paying attention to what's going on and why I think that announcement had a big impact. But before we get into those fine details, I'd really love for you to tell us about the Land and Carbon Lab and a little perhaps about WRI. You've been there for a while. How does this new Land and Carbon Lab build on your work at Global Forest Watch, and what's the vision for the new effort?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Land and Carbon Lab is a new initiative that WRI, Google, University of Maryland, and other partners launched 2 weeks ago. It was a virtual event, and you can still see that event online on YouTube. And we did this with generous support from the Bezos Earth Fund. I guess to put it really simply, what we're trying to do is expand on the work of Global Forest Watch to monitor not only the world's forests, but all the world's land and its nature-based carbon. And like Global Forest Watch, our work starts with, but does not end with monitoring. What I think we do really well at WRI is figuring out how to get the right information in the right hands to affect change, because we deeply understand that at the end of the day, data doesn't create impact, people do. And I think the big change we want to see right now that's motivating us at Land and Carbon Lab is to rapidly scale up investment in an implementation of nature-based solutions to climate change. Ending deforestation, of course, is one of these solutions. If we want to stay on a 1.5-degree pathway, we also need to restore millions of hectares of forests and other degraded ecosystems. We also need to radically transform agriculture. So these are really big, complicated, and ultimately quite interconnected challenges. So we understand that we can't tackle those problems in silos. And I think what the Land and Carbon Lab is trying to do is provide the independent data that can power more holistic strategies, create accountability, foster trust, et cetera.
I really appreciate that. I joke around a lot in the various institutions I work with on silos of excellence and how we need to break down those walls. So I really, really appreciate that. So the Land and Carbon Lab is going to harness new technology that will allow you to map forests down to the 10-meter resolution. That's huge. That's incredible. That's game changing, right? What kind of information will a 10-meter resolution yield, and what will the effect have of that new technology?
Sure, yeah, the technology is pretty incredible these days, and it's accelerating so rapidly. Right now, Global Forest Watch can monitor forests at 30-meter resolution, right? So 10 meters may not sound like a huge improvement, but it's actually 9 times higher resolution than 30. So what does that mean in terms of what we can actually see on the ground? At 30 meters, we can see a new road cutting through a forest. But at 10 meters, we also see the selective logging that starts to form around that road. So it's not outright deforestation, but it's degradation that results in carbon emissions that affects the overall health of and future of the forest. And that degradation was largely invisible to us before. So when it comes to monitoring all land and land cover change, we can just see a lot more detail at that 10-meter resolution. And with that detail, we can more accurately estimate carbon emissions and removals that are associated with those changes. But I do want to say, I think it's a really important point. We tend to get really obsessed with spatial resolution of data. So, 30 meters today, 10 meters tomorrow. Can we get to 5? Can we get to 1? And my answer is, stick with the lowest resolution that is needed to get the job done. Because the higher resolution you go, the more expensive it is, the more processing that is required. So don't just assume you need 5-meter resolution planet imagery when 30-meter resolution Landsat imagery might be totally adequate for the problem you're trying to solve. It really has to be, the solution has to be specific to the problem.
Yeah, I've had this conversation in other sectors, and even with my own kids, of course, don't let perfect be the enemy of the good. I think just that it's really emphasized now, the climate clock that we are working against is going to require speed and scale. So I hear you loud and clear. I also heard what you said just a minute ago on the sort of role that WRI has played, and I've had the great benefit of working with some of your colleagues for the last couple of years on that policy translation. And I think that's really important as it relates to Glasgow. A lot of the audience today is going to be more on the investment side. So I want to unpack these kinds of things in different ways with you. So speaking of Glasgow and COP26, what is your initial reaction to the pledge, 110 countries commitment to halt deforestation by 2030 in your view? Is that possible?
It better be possible. I think political ambition and commitment is a good thing, but it's really just the starter pistol at the beginning of the marathon. It started the race, but we still need to run 26 miles. And we did see a similar set of commitments in 2014 with the New York Declaration on Forests. And of course, we failed to meet those targets by a long shot. So, the commitments are needed. I do feel more optimism this time around than last time, I think for a few reasons. One, we see some new countries at the table who weren't there back in 2014, including Brazil. And if you don't have Brazil, you really can't tackle this problem. We see the financial sector coming on board in a more significant way. And that's really important because getting deforestation out of their lending and investment portfolios really helps to put the pressure on the companies. We see more recognition of the role of Indigenous peoples and local communities as critical to solving this problem. So some of the money that's been pledged is destined to go straight to communities. There's additional money on the table to support strengthening of communities' tenure rights. And then I'd also say that, even though we failed on 2020, the effort we all put in over the last decade, it wasn't for naught, right? So we learned a lot, we innovated a lot, and I think of it as like training. So we are now in much better shape to tackle this next decade worth of commitments. But at the end of the day, we still need to see these commitments translate into concrete national targets, strategies, actions, and we're going to need a lot of domestic political pressure to hold leaders accountable to following through. Otherwise, we will blow through the 2030 goal just like we blew through the 2020 goal.
Thank you for that perspective, Crystal. Sort of just picking up on that, you said when the lab launched 2 weeks ago, it is necessary but not sufficient to know where deforestation is happening, to your earlier point about being perfect. How can the countries use the wealth of new information from the Land and Carbon Lab to move from these commitments that you're talking about to action?
Yeah, so I'm glad you picked up on that one line from the launch, because I think it's really important. One thing that it keeps me up at night is we're monitoring the forest really well, and we can do that for the rest of our lives. And all we may do is document in great detail the demise of the world's forests, and that's not the outcome any of us want. So, one of the motivations behind Land and Carbon Lab is really confronting the fact that the driving forces behind deforestation are largely found outside the forests, right? It's the expansion of agriculture, mining, infrastructure, and the demand for commodities that is behind that. So if we want to stop deforestation, we need to figure out how to change those driving forces. And Land and Carbon Lab is really trying to, again, provide the data that gives us that more complete picture of global land use dynamics, so we can tackle those bigger problems and start to design strategies to address them more effectively. If I could touch quickly on this question of the global land squeeze that we brought up in launch. We expect the world population is going to reach 10 billion by 2050, right? And that includes a growing middle class. And these people are going to need more food, more fuel, more fiber. And if we continue business as usual practices, that means the global footprint of agriculture is going to need to expand twice the size of India to meet all that new demand. And that expansion is going to come at the cost of forests and other critical ecosystems, because we don't have lots of vacant, underutilized land just sitting around to meet those needs. So somehow we need to figure out how to support 10 billion people without expanding the footprint of agriculture. And that is the really big challenge. And data can help us design strategies, but again, need a lot of innovation, need a lot of political commitment to follow through on that.
Yeah, I think you brought it up at the top of our Zoom here, is just the interconnected nature of all of this. And I think the role for WRI is really just telling that story and giving visual to it so people can really wrap their head around it. I mean, when you use numbers like 2 billion and 6 billion new humans or whatever, it's hard to really conceptualize, but I think you guys do a really good job. You sort of answered one of the questions I was going to ask about this population increase in terms of like the role of the lab and Land and Carbon Lab in terms of helping policymakers. Do you want to unpack a little bit about what you guys actually do to help educate on how to use land more efficiently, and what can be done in the next couple decades?
Great. So we have a finite amount of land on Earth. We're asking a lot of it right now. We want to protect the forest. We want to restore more forests. We want to produce more commodities to support our population, right? So policymakers are facing really difficult decisions about how lands are used and by whom. And if you want to optimize the use of land, whether it's across your town or your country, and balance your climate goals, your conservation goals, your development goals, there's some really critical information you need, right? So first you need a decent baseline about what you already have and how it's being used. And that may seem really simple, but a lot of countries don't actually have up-to-date, high-resolution maps of their land and land cover. And information about land tenure, who owns the land, who manages land, is even harder to come by. And then second, you need data that can help you understand what the implications of different strategies or scenarios might be, right? So if we employ strategy X, how much carbon could we potentially remove? Or if we try strategy Y, how much is that going to increase the productivity of agriculture in my country? So we need data to inform our choices. And then once we've made some informed choices, we need data to be able to see whether any of it's working or not, right? Because even the best laid plans can fail, and we'll never know if we can't monitor. And I think we need to see much more adaptive management of our climate strategies moving forward than we've seen in the past. So yeah, three things: the baseline, the scenario building, and then the monitoring of real impact in real time.
That's great, and really, really insightful. And just makes me wonder, in terms of the 110 countries that have engaged, do you have any analysis at the top of your head in terms of where they're at in that progression along these three measures?
I would say there are more gaps than shining stars. Even in the US, where we have some of the best data in the world, there is still a lot we don't know, we can't measure, we can't monitor. So,
okay.
Yeah.
Bringing all the good news, Crystal. Okay, so back to the audience that's joining us today with RockCreek Global Investment. I want to kind of focus it for them for a moment, just talk about how business can invest in nature-based solutions you know that they need credible, independent data, which is what we've been talking about in order to invest with confidence. What kind of information could the Land and Carbon Lab provide or make useful, make available for investors to help, in their role in solving this problem?
Yeah, that's going to be a major focus for us in this work. Let me start by saying that, we often hear that nature is the cheapest mitigation option. And that's, I think that's true. Planting a tree is certainly cheaper than buying an electric vehicle, for example. But what is not often said is that measuring and monitoring carbon emissions and removals from nature is not cheap or easy. And in fact, it's actually much harder and more expensive than in other sectors. And I think this has been one of the biggest barriers to be able to getting carbon markets to work for nature-based solutions. And really for anyone, even outside of carbon markets, anyone who wants to invest, whether it's their private capital or their donor money into nature. So, I think investors ultimately, they want to know that if they're investing in a project or a carbon offset, that they are buying real, additional, permanent carbon offsets, and that it's not resulting in some leakage or unintended consequences elsewhere. And the current systems and data we have haven't really been enough to create that trust. So we're trying to step in with Land and Carbon Lab to see if we can provide the independent, high-resolution data on carbon emissions and removals from land sector activities that can be used to cross-reference what is being reported by projects and by countries. I will say, though, that just putting more data out there can sometimes make the problem worse rather than better, because lately what we see is there's data being reported from different sources. They're not necessarily telling the same story, and people don't know what to believe, right? So we don't just need to put the data out there. We need to explain how different data coming from different scales are telling a consistent story, how they're aligning. And that requires some work around aligning methods, definitions, et cetera. So we plan to work in that space as well.
Yep, it's all part of the work and all sounds very familiar. Well, let me just piggyback on that one. At RockCreek, we hear all the time from our clients and partners, I believe in climate change and I understand the sense of urgency, but where can I invest to be part of the solution? So based on your work over 15 years, what are the most important areas for investors to consider to have the maximum impact?
I might start by being a little bit annoying and flip your question around and say, what are you not investing in? So I think it's important for all of us to take a look at our own investment and retirement portfolios and saying, am I invested into sectors and industries that are part of the climate problem? Just like financial institutions were part of this recent deforestation pledge, we need to look hard at the incentives we're creating through our own personal investments. So I'd start there. Then I would say, forests are still really critical. They're 90% of terrestrial carbon stores, so we have to keep forests standing. But if we want to keep forests standing, like I was saying earlier, we need transformational changes in agriculture. We need rapid innovation and solutions deployment that, again, help us produce more on less land. So I would say that's a good place to invest as well.
That's really, really helpful. And I think really important way to help folks think about the problem set. Got two more questions. I know that we've kind of gone over our time, but this is really important stuff. I should have opened, Crystal, by letting you know that I went to forestry school. So I'm going to end with one, favorite tree question. But before I do that, COP26 is wrapping up at the end of the week. What should we watch out for, and what do you expect in the weeks and months ahead?
Yeah, and I think, like I said earlier, it's about, can we translate all this high-level political commitment into concrete strategies and actions at the country level, at the state level, city level? One thing that looks really different to me now compared to 10 years ago is that climate change is so much more real and present and urgent for the average person than it was before. So more and more people are feeling the impacts of climate change in their lives. And while on one hand, that's quite terrifying, to me, it's also a reason for hope, because ultimately politicians aren't going to follow through on these commitments unless we ask them to over and over and over again. So look for whether that public accountability really shows up in the next couple of years. The other thing I would say is, as we hopefully sometime in the near future start to break free from COVID, how are forests and nature more broadly being considered as countries start to build back? When we're creating these economic recovery plans, will they also support our conservation and climate goals? I think it's something we need to be looking for and asking for in the coming years.
This is really good insights. Okay, so I promised to end with a fun question because this is all very heady stuff, but I'm a kindred spirit from forestry school. So why don't we share our favorite trees? I know we love them all equally, but.
Yeah, I used to live in Central Oregon, and they have a lot of juniper trees there. And it was one of my favorite things of getting off of the airplane, and you can just smell the juniper. And I won't ever forget that smell.
That's pretty special. Oh, I'm a Michigan native, so I could go with the state tree, but Quercus macrocarpa, the bur oak, was my favorite tree. It is my favorite tree. It's just a stately, huggable tree that I spent a lot of time in Ann Arbor, went to graduate school there, so love that tree. Well, listen, oh yeah, and this has been both super enlightening, a little bit depressing, but as you said, I think hope is really the ingredient as we look to the next generation and how we're going to take care of what we've got now. I want to thank you for joining us and spending, part of your busy day. You're doing such important work and have been. Really thrilled to learn more about the lab. And thanks to RockCreek for opening this up during a busy COP26. And thanks for everyone who came and attended today. We really appreciate you. Thanks, Crystal.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.